In 1962, just months after Commander Alan Shepard became the first American to go to space, President John F. Kennedy made a bold proclamation.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
On July 20th, 1969, President Kennedy's promise came true. Neil Armstrong, a U.S. Navy test pilot born and raised in Ohio, became the first human being to set foot on the moon. He and Edwin Buzz Aldrin spent 3 days on the surface of the moon, then returned to Earth.
The Apollo missions were a monumental achievement for humanity, the culmination of millennia of scientific advancement, a seemingly impossible task, almost too impossible. How were scientists able to guide a rocket 238,000 miles with less computing power than a pocket calculator? How were they able to accomplish this task when the Soviet Union had previously beat them in every step of the space race? And why is the flag rippling in the video footage of the moon landing if there's no gravity on the moon?
Any American who was alive in 1969 can tell you where they were when Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon. 500 million people tuned in to watch the event live on television.
In a decade full of conflict and tragedy, the moon landing was a celebration of human ingenuity and engineering. But it also signified the technological dominance of the United States over the Soviets during the hostility of the Cold War.
This story really begins 2 decades before President Kennedy made his promise to put a man on the moon.
World War II brought rapid advances in technology as nations around the world put every resource they had into strengthening their militaries. These technological advances included incredible breakthroughs in science and engineering.
One scientist who rose to prominence during the war was Wernher von Braun. As a child in Germany, he was fascinated with rocket technology. He watched in awe as German drivers used rocket-powered cars to break land speed records.
In 1933, when von Braun was 21, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party seized control of the German government. The Nazis ignored the Treaty of Versailles and began rebuilding their military, which had been destroyed in the First World War.
After von Braun earned his doctorate in 1934, he went to work directly for the German army. They funded his research at Peenemünde, their army rocket center located in northern Germany. The Nazis understood rocket technology's potential as a weapon, and von Braun was on the cutting edge. Working for the government, he officially joined the Nazi Party in 1937, and in 1940, he became an officer of the SS, the same military unit that built and oversaw concentration camps.
By this time, the Nazi government had already begun to segregate and imprison Germany's Jewish population, the first acts of what would become the Holocaust.
Later in life, von Braun described his relationship with the Nazis as complex. He claimed that he had joined because if he refused, he would have been unable to continue his work on rocket technology and pursue his dreams of space travel.
As World War II raged across Europe, von Braun worked diligently at the Nazi missile base. With the help of the best and brightest prisoners of war plucked from the concentration camps, he began production of the V-2 rocket. Hitler personally referred to the V-2 as a vengeance weapon. It was designed to launch missiles from northern Germany to London. This was the first time in history that long-range rockets were used as an effective weapon of war.
It far surpassed the rocket technology of the Allied forces and the Soviet Union, who struggled to develop their own rocket-based weaponry.
The Soviets were hindered because before the war had started, they had imprisoned one of their leading rocket scientists, a man named Sergei Korolev.
In 1938, Korolev was accused of participating in counter-revolutionary activity. Like many of the supposed dissidents rounded up in Stalin's purges, the charges against Korolev were completely made up. Nevertheless, he was sentenced to hard labor in a Siberian gulag.
During the war, Korolev and several other engineers had continued to work on developing rocket technology and aircraft from the comfort of the Gulag, but their efforts were poorly managed. The Soviets were outmatched by the Germans, and the Red Army had little air support as the Germans marched across Russia.
In 1944, the Allied forces landed in France and were able to turn the tide on the Western Front. But even as the German armies retreated, von Braun's rockets struck fear into the hearts of the Allies.
The German rockets rained death on London, killing almost 3,000 people, most of them civilians.
It wasn't until April of 1945, in the final weeks of the war, that the Soviets finally captured the V-2 production factory in central Germany.
And the Soviet army was horrified by the conditions they found. The factory was entirely run on slave labor from Jewish, Roma, and Russian prisoners.
Well, they apparently weren't too horrified. As soon as the Germans were cleared out, the Soviets decided to get the V-2 factory back up and running. They freed Sergei Korolev from the Gulag and put him in charge of operations.
1 month later, on May 8, 1945, the Nazis surrendered to the Allied forces. Von Braun and several of his scientists fled to the Western Front and surrendered directly to the American army. Why? They hoped the OSS, the wartime precursor to the CIA, might help them find safe haven in America.
They were right. The OSS was afraid von Braun's knowledge of rocket technology would fall into the Soviets' hands. Although the U.S. and Soviet Union had been allies during World War II, both countries knew their ideological differences would set them on a collision course after the war was over.
The American government helped von Braun and his Nazi scientists flee Germany and resettle in New Mexico. Frequent listeners might recall this from our episodes on Operation Paperclip, the covert initiative that hid Nazis in America.
Just a few weeks after Germany's surrender, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the first time in history scientists had been able to harness the destructive power of the atom. But what truly made it unstoppable was that the United States only needed a single plane to drop one on Japan. Previous bombing campaigns required a massive fleet of aircraft.
But what's even more efficient than carrying a nuclear weapon on an airplane? Mounting it onto a rocket. Von Braun and his team were put to work on improving the V-2 rocket.
Meanwhile, over in the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev managed to successfully replicate the V-2 design with a rocket they dubbed the R-1. But he soon realized it would be insufficient to meet the needs of the Soviet Army.
The R-1, like the V-2, had a limited range. It was unable to carry a payload as heavy as an atomic bomb, and it only hit its target about half the time.
So Korolev began designing his own rockets. In 1947, his next rocket, called the R-2, successfully doubled the range of the V-2.
And this was bad news for the Americans. Now that the war was over, the U.S. and Soviet Union were no longer playing nice.
But by 1949, the Soviets had developed their own atomic bomb. Because of this, both the United States and the Soviet Union knew neither country would survive a direct military confrontation.
Instead, their conflict played out in proxy wars all over the world. The Japanese Empire had previously invaded and occupied both China and Korea. When they were defeated in World War II, it created a power vacuum that both the Soviets and the Americans sought to fill. Each nation wanted an ally.
As a result, the United States worked to install ostensibly democratic governments that would be friendly to their interests, and the Soviet Union fomented communist revolutions that would be united against American influence.
The Chinese Civil War raged from 1945 to 1950, until the Communist Party prevailed with the Soviet Union's help. The nationalist government, backed by American forces, retreated to Taiwan, which they still control to this day.
Korea was next. The Soviet Union had invaded the Japanese-controlled Korea from the north during World War II to assist their American allies. After Japan's surrender, the Soviets continued to occupy the northern half of the peninsula, while the Americans remained in the south.
Two sovereign governments were established during the occupation, and both governments saw themselves as the sole legitimate ruler of the Korean peninsula. In 1950, the Communist North invaded the Republic of Korea in the South, launching the Korean War.
It was a brutal conflict resulting in over 1 million deaths and ended in a stalemate that still endangers international relations today.
But for both world superpowers, something even more devastating was looming on the horizon. Up next, we'll look at how far technology developed during the Cold War. Now, back to the story.
In 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, a nuclear weapon that was several orders of magnitude more powerful than the bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima during the war.
By 1955, Russia had a hydrogen bomb of their own. In addition to being more powerful, these weapons were also much heavier than traditional atomic bombs. What that meant was they needed more powerful rockets.
Both nations began to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. These were massive rockets that would not only be able to lift a hydrogen bomb, but deliver it anywhere on Earth with pinpoint accuracy.
Rocket scientist Sergei Korolev worked to develop the Soviet ICBM, but he saw the potential of the technology beyond weapons. He envisioned his rockets as a vessel that could help man reach the heavens.
But his Soviet superiors weren't interested in space travel. They told him to keep his head down or it was back to the gulag.
Meanwhile, former Nazi scientist Wernher Von Braun was building intermediate-range rockets for the United States Army.
Von Braun grew impatient with this task. He, too, had hoped to develop larger rockets that would be capable of reaching space, but the Army wouldn't listen. So instead, he took his pitch directly to the American people.
In 1955, Disney produced a TV special where Von Braun explained the potential of rocket technology for space exploration. The public loved it. Wernher Von Braun became a household name.
And Von Braun's pitch actually worked. The American government announced that they would launch a satellite into orbit within the next 3 years.
It was announced as a scientific mission, and the satellite would collect data from space. But behind the scenes, the CIA understood that attaching a camera to a satellite would allow them to photograph anywhere on Earth. They worked to develop these spy satellites in a top-secret program separate from Von Braun's mission.
The American announcement was just what Korolev needed. The Soviets were interested in showing their superiority over the Americans in any way, shape, or form. Korolev was easily able to convince his superiors that beating the Americans into space would be a great victory for their communist ideals. They gave him approval to begin the foundations of the Soviet space program.
By 1956, after just 1 year of research, Von Braun believed that one of the Redstone rockets he had developed with the Army could launch a satellite into orbit. He presented his findings to the government.
However, due to PR concerns about his Nazi past, the government didn't want Von Braun's name tied to their first satellite launch. Instead, they awarded the contract to the Navy.
The Navy was not up to the task. The project floundered, the budget spiraled out of control, and construction ended up a year behind schedule.
Where they failed, Korolev succeeded. In August of 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the R-7, the world's first true intercontinental ballistic missile. A rocket that was not only powerful enough to carry a nuclear warhead almost anywhere on the planet, but was also to break free from Earth's gravity and place a satellite into orbit.
After the R-7's successful test launch, Soviet leadership told Korolev that the next launch would carry a satellite into space. His team only had a month and a half to build that satellite.
Korolev personally oversaw the satellite's design. It would be spherical, about the size of a beach ball, and hollow except for a simple radio transponder that could communicate from space. Anything more complex would have been too heavy to lift or could have thrown off the delicate balance of the rocket.
On October 4th, 1957, that small aluminum sphere, affectionately dubbed Sputnik by the Soviet scientists, was successfully launched into orbit. The the space age had begun. All over the world, people were able to hear Sputnik's transmission above them. Although the sound was only a simple electronic beep at regular intervals, it scared the American people. If the Soviets could beat us into space, could they beat us in an all-out war?
Just 1 month later, on November 3rd, 1957, the Russians sent a second satellite into space, this time with a passenger, a stray dog they named Laika, who became the first living creature in space.
Laika lasted 5 hours before perishing from the heat inside the capsule.
Humiliated by the Soviet success, the Navy rushed to prepare a satellite for launch atop their Vanguard rocket. The satellite they designed was even smaller than Sputnik, weighing less than 3 pounds.
Von Braun criticized their effort, declaring that given the chance, his team would be able to put a satellite into space in 60 days. He predicted that the Vanguard would never make it.
He was right. On December 6, 1957, the world's press gathered for the Vanguard's first launch. The rocket was only able to lift 4 feet into the air before it fell over and exploded on the launch pad.
As a final humiliation, the satellite on top was blown clear of the explosion and started transmitting from the ground. The press referred to it as Kaputnik.
The Americans turned back to Von Braun. The Jupiter C rocket, part of the Redstone program he had developed with the Army, only needed slight modifications to be able to carry a satellite into space.
Just 1 month later, in January of 1958, Von Braun succeeded, launching a satellite named Explorer 1 into orbit. Explorer 1 did far more than just send a simple radio transmission. It was the first satellite to actually collect scientific data from space.
In July of 1958, President Eisenhower created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Von Braun and his team of rocket scientists were transferred into the program. Their next goal was to put an American in space.
Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to demonstrate their technological superiority. In September of 1959, their Luna 2 probe sent back close-up photographs of the moon's surface before its planned crash.
The Soviets timed the mission to occur while Premier Nikita Khrushchev was touring the United States, to add to the humiliation.
The very next month, their Luna 3 probe became the first satellite to fully orbit the moon with a camera to photograph its far side. This was the first time humans had ever seen the dark side of the moon.
As both countries pressed on, tension increased between the two superpowers. That same year, Fidel Castro's communist revolution seized full control of the Cuban government.
This meant the Soviet Union had an ally just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, from which they could potentially stage a ground invasion of the United States. The pressure was really on the ground and in space.
In August of 1960, 2 Russian dogs named Belka and Strelka became the first living creatures to orbit the Earth and return safely. Korolev had come one step closer to his goal of sending a man into space.
In January of 1961, the Americans took a further step. They tested their Mercury capsule using a chimpanzee named Enos.
The animal survived the trip, but Von Braun decided the technology was still too dangerous to risk sending a human life into space.
The Soviet Union didn't share the former Nazi officer's concern for human life. Even though there were still questions about whether or not Korolev's rocket could bring a person safely back from space, they went ahead with the mission anyway.
Their human test subject would be a pilot named Yuri Gagarin. He was the ideal communist hero. He came from a humble background, born and raised in a small village near the Polish border. His father was a bricklayer and his mother was a milkmaid. The family worked on a collective farm.
On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. The journey was perilous. The retro rockets that were designed to slow his trajectory failed to detach from his capsule, sending him careening out of control.
Gagarin was forced to eject, but still landed safely on Earth, completing his historic journey.
Some theorists wonder if Gagarin was actually the first cosmonaut to orbit the Earth, or simply the first to come back alive. The Russians conducted their space program in complete secrecy, announcing missions only after their completion. With the Soviet government's iron-fisted control of the media, any previous failed launches would have been easy to cover up.
Either way, the Soviets had gone to space, and the Americans were close behind. 1 month after Gagarin, in May of 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American to reach space aboard the Mercury program spacecraft Freedom 7. His flight lasted a total of 15 minutes, with only 6 of those actually being in space.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
20 days after Shepard's flight, President Kennedy announced before a joint session of Congress that America would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
This was an impossibly ambitious promise. A journey to the moon would take several days of spaceflight. They would need a probe that could successfully orbit the moon and a separate probe that would be able to detach and land on the moon's surface while carrying enough fuel to launch back into space and reunite with the orbiting probe.
And after all of that, there would still be the 238,000-mile journey back to Earth. No rocket in existence had the combination of thrust and stability to carry the massive weight of all those probes without exploding.
At this time, no American astronaut had even reached Earth's orbit.
There was massive political pressure behind Kennedy's announcement. The United States had been humiliated by the success of the Soviet space program and had failed to stop the spread of communism around the globe. Landing a man on the moon was the only option left to prove American superiority to the Soviet Union.
But just a few months later, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union came as close as it ever would to all-out military confrontation. In October of 1962, during the height of the Cold War, the American military placed nuclear-capable ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey. In response, the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba. This was referred to as the Cuban Missile Crisis.
President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba and demanded the Soviets withdraw their weaponry. For a tense 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation.
Finally, an agreement was reached. The Soviets withdrew the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the Americans withdrawing their missiles from Turkey. For a moment, everything went back to normal.
But the peace only lasted a year. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Vice President Lyndon Johnson assumed the office of president.
He vowed to follow through on President Kennedy's promises, including landing a man on the moon.
This undertaking was named the Apollo program. NASA took the name from the Greek god of the sun and light.
Wernher Von Braun unveiled plans for the Saturn V rocket, which was 4 times the height and 100 times the weight of the rocket that had carried Alan Shepard into space. The Saturn V would be one of the largest machines ever built.
It used 5 engines working together to achieve the gargantuan amounts of thrust necessary to lift the massive rocket free from Earth's gravity.
Von Braun's scientists would also need to develop a guidance system accurate enough to reach the moon 238,000 miles away. No easy task.
Especially since it wasn't until July of 1964 that an American probe even reached the moon's surface, a feat the Russians had accomplished 5 years earlier.
While the conflict between the United States and Russia was playing out in space, it was also playing out in Vietnam. In March of 1965, the first U.S. Marines set foot on the ground in Da Nang, launching the U.S.'s formal involvement in the Vietnam War.
That very same month, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first man to walk in space, exiting his capsule hundreds of miles above the Earth's surface.
He almost didn't survive. While in the vacuum of space, Leonov's spacesuit inflated. Without the pressure of Earth's atmosphere to keep it in check, the oxygen inside his suit expanded outward, rendering him immobile.
Russian mission control watched in terror for 12 minutes as Leonov struggled to get himself back into the capsule. Finally, on Korolov's suggestion, Leonov manually vented the air from his own suit, allowing him to re-enter the capsule.
The Soviet Union never revealed to the world just how close Leonov came to death. They kept their space program a closely guarded secret, while America's entire march toward the moon played out across public newsreels.
Just 2 months after Leonov, in June of 1965, astronaut Edward White became the first American to complete a spacewalk.
In December of 1965, the astronauts aboard NASA's Gemini 7 spent a full 2 weeks in Earth's orbit, setting a record that would stand for 5 years. America was finally catching up to Russia's early wins.
While Korolov's accomplishments had often outpaced Von Braun, he was never able to build a rocket on the scale of the Saturn V. He attempted to do so with a rocket called the N1, but when he requested funding from the Soviet government, he was given only a fraction of what he needed.
The N1's design used 32 separate engines to achieve the thrust necessary for lunar flight. The rocket was tested 4 times, but all 4 launches ended in disaster. The program was canceled soon after.
It looked like the Soviet space program's glory days were coming to an end. In January of 1966, Sergei Korolev died during a routine surgery.
His heart gave out under the anesthetic. It had been weakened by the years he spent doing hard labor in the Gulag.
After his death, Soviet Premier Brezhnev finally announced Sergei Korolev's name to the world. He was given a full state funeral with a parade in Red Square.
For 20 years, Korolev had remained completely anonymous while he pushed forward the realms of what man thought possible. Finally, the world knew his name.
1 month after his death, Russia achieved the first soft landing of a probe on the moon. All previous lunar probes had been designed to either orbit the moon or send back data before crashing into the moon's surface. But this one landed intact.
America began to catch up. In March of 1966, the Gemini spacecraft, piloted by Neil Armstrong, docked with a separate satellite in space, the first time 2 spacecraft had successfully linked up within Earth's orbit.
In June of 1966, the United States achieved their own soft landing on the moon with an unmanned probe, and in August of 1966, they achieved their first successful lunar orbit.
But in January of 1967, disaster struck the American space program. The mission, designated AS-204, was supposed to be the first manned mission of the Apollo program.
While on the launch pad, a small spark ignited the pure oxygen environment of the capsule. All 3 astronauts on board were killed in the fire. NASA's engineers had failed to anticipate the danger pure oxygen posed to the capsule's occupants.
The mission would be renamed Apollo 1 as a commemoration of the fallen astronauts.
In televised hearings, members of Congress tore into NASA's leadership for the disaster. It became clear that no more mistakes would be tolerated. The Apollo program itself was at stake.
The American people were counting on NASA to fulfill President Kennedy's promise to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Congress made it very clear. Failure was not an option.
12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
In November of 1967, Von Braun's work culminated in the launch of an unmanned Saturn V rocket, designated Apollo 4. The rocket was the heaviest thing to ever leave Earth's surface, approximately the weight of a Navy battlecruiser.
450 NASA technicians were on hand to manage the launch. Because the rocket was so massive, the press was ordered to stay 3.5 miles away for their own safety.
Apollo 4 was a complete success. But in April of 1968, the second Saturn V launch, called Apollo 6, experienced problems when two engines malfunctioned.
Nevertheless, NASA decided to press on with a manned Saturn V launch. The mission was named Apollo 8.
In December of 1968, the three astronauts on board the Apollo 8 became the first humans to leave Earth's orbit. They journeyed around the moon, becoming the first humans to see its dark side with their own eyes and return safely to Earth.
They were also the first humans to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts.
These belts are fields of radioactive particles that surround the Earth, thousands of miles above its surface. The Apollo missions and the 24 astronauts who participated in them are the only humans in history to leave Earth's orbit and pass through these belts.
Soviet scientists theorized that this radiation would be dangerous and that heavy lead shielding would be required to protect the astronauts. The lead shielding would, of course, make any spacecraft too heavy to fly.
NASA dismissed claims that the Van Allen radiation would be dangerous to astronauts, pointing out that the missions only spent a few hours passing through them and that the radiation exposure was little more than that of a CT scan.
So they kept pressing on. In March of 1969, Apollo 9 conducted a test launch of the lunar module into Earth's orbit, and in May of 1969, Apollo 10 orbited the moon with the lunar module, a dry run for the actual moon landing mission. The mission was a success. It was showtime.
On July 16, 1969, 1 million people gathered in Cape Canaveral to watch the Apollo 11 launch in person. Another 25 million people around the country watched the launch live on television.
This rocket, carrying Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, would be the first manned mission to land on the moon.
After the rocket reached Earth's orbit, NASA Mission Control in Houston told the astronauts that they were go for TLI, that is, translunar injection, the final stage of the rocket launch.
After the 4-day journey to the moon, Apollo 11 entered the lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the Eagle, the capsule that would take them to the moon's surface, while Michael Collins remained in orbit on the rocket. As Collins circled the moon, he became the most isolated man in human history. Unable to make radio contact while on the dark side of the moon and thousands of miles away from the other members of his crew, he was all alone in a vast universe.
For Armstrong and Aldrin, landing safely on the moon was not a guarantee. The moon's surface is uneven and pockmarked by craters. A year earlier, during a test of the landing module on Earth's surface, Armstrong had been forced to eject.
According to the post-accident investigation, Armstrong would have died if he had chosen to eject even a half-second later.
Over the moon's surface, Armstrong struggled to find a suitable place to land the capsule. Armstrong burned dangerous amounts of fuel in lateral movement as he desperately sought a surface flat enough to support a landing.
Back in Houston, Mission Control monitored his progress carefully. If they burned too much fuel, they would never be able to generate the lift necessary to leave the moon's surface. Every second counted.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Finally, the lunar capsule touched down in the Sea of Tranquility. This location on the moon had been chosen because it was relatively smooth compared to the rest of the moon's surface.
Neil Armstrong opened the capsule. He descended the 9 steps of the Eagle's ladder and took his first steps onto the moon, forever consecrating his place in the history books.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Armstrong flubbed his line. He meant to say, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind.
Television cameras had been attached to the outside of the capsule so that the world could watch Neil Armstrong's historic first steps live. An estimated 500 million people tuned in from all over the world. That's 1/6 of the Earth's entire population at the time, the largest television audience ever at the time as well.
The camera on Apollo 11 used slow scan technology, which was 30 years old at the time and incompatible with broadcast TV. The feed from that camera was broadcast to the Goldstone Observatory in the Mojave Desert. There, a conventional TV camera was pointed at a monitor, capturing the video from the moon's second hand.
The networks complained to NASA about the poor video quality. After Apollo 11, later missions were broadcast from the moon with more up-to-date color television cameras.
In addition to the live broadcast, Aldrin and Armstrong documented their historic journey in incredible detail, taking 5,771 photographs while on the moon's surface. Armstrong himself appears in only one of these photos, reflected in the face shield of Aldrin's helmet. Of course, it's impossible to discern whether it really was Armstrong and Aldrin's face behind those helmets.
Armstrong and Aldrin planted an American flag on the moon's surface, celebrating the nation of their birth, whose tireless work and extensive resources made the journey possible.
Skeptics have noted that the flag appears to wave in the footage, something that would be impossible on the moon due to the lack of wind in a vacuum.
Officially, the bottom of the flag swings due to the force of Aldrin's movement, not due to wind.
Another thing to note from the photographs, as Armstrong descended from the lunar module, every step he took left a perfect imprint of his boot in the ground. But skeptics have noted that the Eagle itself left no such imprint, despite the massive amount of thrust guiding the capsule's soft landing. There are no craters under the lander in any of the photos taken on the moon's surface, nor is there any dust on the lander's feet.
It almost looks as though the Eagle was placed there.
After the landing, their journey was only halfway over. They still had to make it back to Earth.
President Nixon prepared a statement to the American public in case the unthinkable happened and the astronauts were left stranded on the moon. To quote, "These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know there is no hope for their recovery, but they know there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice."
But this prepared statement was never shared with the public because the lunar module was able to successfully reunite with the rocket orbiting above the surface. The mission was accomplished.
America gave the returning astronauts a hero's welcome. They were eventually sent around the world as goodwill ambassadors. At the end of the turbulent 60s, a decade mired in protests, assassinations, and escalating war, the moon landing gave humanity hope for a brighter future.
In November of 1969, another mission, Apollo 12, returned to the moon with less fanfare. At the time, people called to complain to the networks that their I Love Lucy reruns were being interrupted by the news footage.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt.
Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
In April of 1970, Apollo 13 launched, but never made it to the moon. After a breach in their craft's shell led to an oxygen leak, the three astronauts abandoned ship into the lunar module. With help from the engineers at Mission Control, the astronauts were able to create a makeshift air filter and return safely to Earth.
In December of 1972, Apollo 17 marked the last mission to the moon. More missions were planned, as well as theoretical plans for a permanent base on the moon, but these were canceled as NASA's budget and priorities shifted toward developing the Skylab space station.
By putting the first men on the moon, America was able to declare itself victors in the race to explore space, demonstrating technological superiority over their Soviet rivals in the midst of the Cold War.
Technology has grown in leaps and bounds since the Apollo missions. It has become cheaper and more efficient, and computing power has become exponentially more powerful than the crude machines that guided the Apollo missions. But NASA hasn't sent another manned mission to the moon since Apollo 17, more than 4 decades ago. The question remains, why? If it's so easy to send astronauts into space, why don't we do it again?
That brings us to our sole conspiracy theory in play. The moon landing never happened. The entire Apollo 11 mission was a hoax.
Landing a man on the moon was incredibly difficult. Some would say impossible. Were the technological limitations too great? Is it possible to send humans through the radioactive Van Allen belts? And what do we make of the incongruencies in the photos and video footage from the moon landing?
But on the other hand, could the American government have successfully pulled off the greatest deception in human history?
The moon landing not only cemented America's victory in the space race, it is one of the most important achievements in human history. If it were discovered to be a hoax, it would fundamentally shift our understanding of our place in the universe.
Next week, we'll look at the evidence and search for the truth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
One giant leap for mankind. 500 million people around the world watched live as Neil Armstrong took his first step onto the moon, forever cementing his place in the history books.
But questions remain. Just where exactly was that step taken? Did Apollo 11 really land on the moon's surface? Or was that video broadcast created in a Hollywood studio under the direction of filmmaker Stanley Kubrick?
It's been almost 50 years since Armstrong took his first steps on the moon, and 47 years since the launch of Apollo 17, the last manned mission to the moon. Since then, space travel technology has become exponentially cheaper and more powerful, but we've never gone back.
Could it be because we never actually went to the moon in the first place? Last week, we discussed the official story of the space race, the competitive effort between the United States and the Soviet Union to explore space. Although the Soviets led the race at first, America was able to pull ahead. As the first to land a man on the moon, America declared themselves the victors.
This week, we're looking at the conspiracy theory that the moon landing never happened. The entire Apollo program was a massive hoax.
First, we'll discuss why the United States government would deceive its people. What was at stake? Had the government lied to its people before?
Then we'll take a look at NASA's proof that they went to the moon. They took pictures and broadcast live from the moon's surface, but inconsistencies in the evidence have raised questions about whether the footage was really filmed on the moon or whether it was staged here on Earth.
Finally, we'll examine whether putting a man on the moon was even possible. Conspiracy theorists question whether the U.S. had the technological capabilities to pull off a manned lunar mission, especially given the Soviet Union's technological superiority during the early stages of the space race.
Before we ask whether the conspiracy theories hold water, we have to answer the underlying question. What could have motivated the American government to fake the moon landing?
The space race was much broader than a simple contest between rocket scientists. It was an ideological struggle between the capitalist democracies of the West, led by the United States, and the communist states of the East, controlled by the Soviet Union.
The conflict was referred to as the Cold War because the United States and Russia never had a direct military confrontation, but both nations stockpiled weapons as if a war was imminent.
In 1952, America developed a hydrogen bomb, which was several times more powerful than the bombs they had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 7 years earlier. Russia developed their own H-bombs by 1955, just 3 years later.
These weapons were tested, but never used in war. Both nations adhered to the principle of mutually assured destruction. If either nation attacked the other, they'd be met with bombings powerful enough to destroy the entire world.
So instead of fighting directly, the superpowers battled for ideological dominance of other smaller countries like Korea and Vietnam. The U.S. made it clear they would stop at nothing to defeat communism on the world stage.
As these proxy wars heated up, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union kept one eye on another frontier: space. The rockets they'd been developing for the sake of launching nuclear bombs could just as well be used to launch scientists into space.
By being the first to put a man on the moon, either country could assert their dominance, which led to stronger innovation, the national comradeship of communism or the free enterprise of capitalism.
At first, it looked like communism would be the winner. The Soviets dominated the early years of space exploration, placing Sputnik, the first satellite, into orbit in 1957. 4 years later, a Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to reach space and orbit the Earth.
Months later, in May 1961, American astronaut Alan Shepard would reach space as well, but only for a few minutes. The U.S. was lagging behind. The only milestone left that would prove the superiority of capitalism was to land a man on the moon.
After Shepard's flight in 1961, President John F. Kennedy declared before a joint session of Congress that the United States would put a man on the moon before the decade's end.
And although Kennedy was assassinated the next year, the United States kept his promise. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong made his famous first step and became the first human to walk on the moon.
Just 66 years after the Wright brothers made their first flight in an airplane, humans flew all the way to the moon.
Needless to say, some people were skeptical. After being bested by the Soviets every step of the way, the U.S. had suddenly accomplished the one technological feat their rivals were incapable of, and just months before their self-imposed deadline, it was almost too convenient to be true.
Faking a moon mission for the sake of propaganda would have been a massive and difficult undertaking.
Luckily, the CIA was no stranger to complex propaganda schemes. They understood that the Cold War was about ideology as much as it was about military dominance, and to defeat communism, a war had to be waged at every level, including culture.
Throughout the Cold War, the CIA funded dozens of programs designed to shift public opinion in their favor. They called these missions PSYOPs, or psychological operations.
Many of these PSYOPs took the form of arts and entertainment grants provided to unwitting modern artists like Jackson Pollock. The CIA saw abstract expressionism as a way to stand apart from the rigid and highly regulated art approved by the Soviet government.
They also laid the foundations for the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop, which is still one of the most prestigious fiction writing programs in America. The curriculum was structured to focus on the idea of American individualism, the antithesis to the unified society the Soviet Union exemplified.
The students enrolled in the program, many of whom would go on to become prominent authors, had no idea their education was being funded by the CIA.
Psychological manipulation was also used to target the Soviet Union directly. In 1984, President Reagan began the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program to develop technologies that would give the U.S. an edge in the nuclear arms race.
The program researched technology like lasers, particle beams, and ground-based missile defense programs. Senator Kennedy derisively referred to the program as Star Wars because it was complete science fiction.
The program touted an early win in 1984 when a prototype missile defense system successfully shot down an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM.
But this win wasn't all it appeared to be. 9 years later, in 1993, 4 top Reagan administration officials confessed that both the defense missile and the ICBM had been secretly fitted with homing devices to guarantee the interception was a success.
The Strategic Defense Initiative cost the U.S. taxpayers $30 million, but the particle beams and advanced missile defense systems never materialized. In 1987, a study concluded that most of the technologies they were trying to develop were decades away from reality.
If the government was willing to fake a missile interception to scare the Soviets, what else might they fake?
The U.S. had the motivation to fake a moon landing, that much is clear. But did they have the means? Pulling off a hoax of that size and keeping it a secret for 50 years would be incredibly difficult. If there had been even the slightest hint that the Apollo missions were faked, the Soviet Union would have exposed it.
It would have been difficult, but maybe not impossible. Coming up, we'll discuss whether it was even possible to fake a mission as significant as the moon landing.
Back to the story.
For 50 years, conspiracy theorists have wondered whether the Apollo 11 moon landing actually happened, or if NASA faked the entire mission as a propaganda tactic.
If that theory were true, there's been shockingly little evidence revealed to support it. An estimated 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program, either directly for NASA or for the defense contractors that manufactured rockets and space capsules. Surely, if there were any deception, somebody would have come forward about it by now.
Conspiracy theorists point out that the Apollo program was heavily compartmentalized. The rockets and spacecraft were manufactured in different factories all over the country. The astronaut selection and training process was separate as well. Only a couple hundred people, maybe fewer, would have been able to see the full picture.
Previously, NASA had given the press nearly unlimited access to its space programs, but Apollo was different. The press was only allowed to report on the scant information they received directly from NASA, without seeing or speaking to the employees directly.
With such tight control, it would have been relatively easy to manufacture a narrative surrounding the Apollo program. Even if journalists questioned what they were being told, they wouldn't have any facts to dispute it.
That may be true, but there are simpler explanations for the secrecy. If sensitive information about the rocket technology leaked to the Soviet Union, it could have given them a leg up in the race to the moon. And the Apollo missions were hardly the first government program to be shrouded in secrecy. Take, for example, the Manhattan Project, which had developed the atomic bomb during World War II. An estimated 139,000 people worked on the project, and not a single detail leaked until it was declassified after the war.
Well, that's not entirely true. Several spies made their way into the Manhattan Project and sent information back to the Soviet Union, which helped the Soviets develop their own atomic bombs. But years after the Apollo missions, the Soviets never accomplished their own moon landing.
This may be a case of the U.S. government learning from their mistakes. It's possible there were no Soviet spies in the Apollo program at all, or if there were, information was tightly controlled enough to prevent leaks.
It's also possible that NASA was swarming with spies, but there was no useful information to report, because the U.S. was no closer to accomplishing a moon landing than the Soviets were.
The issue there is that NASA produced extensive documentation of the moon landing. They took pictures, made films, and even broadcast live from the moon's surface. The evidence of the moon landing is overwhelming.
But the evidence is also full of inconsistencies. Conspiracy theorists posit that the footage from the moon's surface was actually recorded on a sound stage, produced and directed by Stanley Kubrick. While the production was broadcast live to the world, the astronauts aboard the Apollo 11 spent 8 days in lower Earth orbit, nowhere near reaching the moon.
In 1968, Stanley Kubrick released his film 2001: A Space Odyssey, which used groundbreaking special effects to depict space travel and featured scenes that took place on the moon.
Kubrick established a relationship with NASA by hiring high-level engineers to consult on the film. It follows that when NASA needed a filmmaker to stage their moon landing in 1969, they turned back to the expert who'd produced a film full of space travel just the year before.
But the moon scenes in Kubrick's film don't resemble the actual moon landings. The dust behaves differently than in the actual footage, and the fictional astronauts move differently than they do in the moon's real gravity.
The Kubrick Theory has been discussed online since at least 1995. It gained traction in 2002 with the French mockumentary Dark Side of the Moon. The film purports to tell the story of Kubrick's moon landing production, featuring interviews with CIA operatives and Kubrick's former assistants.
Many conspiracy theorists apparently mistook the satirical film for an actual documentary.
The theory gained new life thanks to the 2012 documentary Room 237, which showcased several different interpretations of the popular Kubrick horror film The Shining. One of those interpretations was that the film was Kubrick's veiled confession to the moon landing hoax.
The conspiracy theorist in the documentary claims that Jack Nicholson's character's descent into madness was supposed to represent Kubrick's own guilt after faking the moon landing. They also point to a sweater that Danny, the child in the film, wears in a few scenes, featuring an embroidered rocket. As a work of film analysis, it's fascinating, but as actual evidence of a conspiracy, it's pretty thin.
A few conspiracy theorists claim that the rumors started when Kubrick's wife confessed to the moon landing hoax back in the 70s.
But that confession has never been verified. It's most likely nothing more than another rumor.
In 2015, a video surfaced online that purported to show Kubrick himself confessing to the moon landing hoax just before his passing in 1999.
But this was also proven to be a hoax. A prankster spliced together real footage of Kubrick talking with a fake voiceover from an impersonator.
So there's not much evidence for Kubrick's involvement. But it's still possible that he or someone else staged the famous footage of the moon landing.
It would have been difficult to stage a hoax of that magnitude on live broadcast with 500 million people tuned in. If anything went wrong, it would have been pretty obvious to anyone watching.
But the video could have been pre-recorded. Remember, as per the official story, the video was broadcast from a TV camera pointing at a monitor, supposedly because the camera aboard the Apollo rocket was too old to be compatible with broadcast technology. The video on that monitor could have been live, or it could have been pre-recorded. TV networks wouldn't have known the difference.
The quality of the live broadcast itself has also raised questions. Wherever and whenever it was recorded, the grainy footage of Neil Armstrong stepping off the lunar module was made using 30-year-old technology. NASA chose this outdated technology because the low bandwidth it used required less energy to broadcast back to Earth.
But conspiracy theorists argue that they chose the jerry-rigged system and low-quality output to hide the fact that they were playing pre-recorded footage made with less than perfect special effects technology. But even with the grainy, lo-fi footage, there are discrepancies in the video that raise some questions.
A 2001 documentary called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon lays out most of the evidence against the official moon landing footage. The director, Bart Sibrel, is one of the most outspoken anti-moon landing conspiracy theorists. He gained notoriety in 2002 by confronting Apollo astronaut Buzz Aldrin and asking him to swear on the Bible that he's telling the truth about the moon landings.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Aldrin punched him in the face. No charges were filed against Aldrin after it was decided that he had been provoked.
Sibrel claims that he requested material from NASA for his documentary and received an hour of unedited footage that was never supposed to be seen by the public.
NASA disputes that the footage was ever meant to be secret. They point out that the footage is widely available to anyone willing to ask for it, like Sibrel.
Either way, these outtakes from the official NASA footage feature the 3 astronauts on the Apollo 11 creating the famous shots of the Earth floating in space through the spacecraft window. In another clip, you can hear the astronauts discussing blocking out the light from the other windows, which was causing a glare in the shot.
Sibrel argues that what we saw in the footage wasn't actually the Earth floating in space. He claims that what appears to be the entire planet floating in the darkness of space is actually just a bit of Earth's surface as seen from the spaceship's circular window, illuminated against the spaceship's dark walls.
Some of the footage is compelling. In one shot, a shadowy figure passes between the camera and temporarily blocks out the edges of the supposed Earth, as if an astronaut's arm has floated into the shot. This wouldn't be possible if the camera were really pressed up against the window, as NASA claims.
Unless whoever was holding the camera accidentally fumbled or put their finger over the lens.
But furthermore, there are no distinguishing geographical features such as oceans or continents, one would expect if one were indeed looking at the entire Earth.
Although perhaps the cameras designed for use on Earth weren't perfectly suited for capturing detail in space. The continents and oceans could have been indistinguishable simply because of technical limitations. NASA has also responded that if the Apollo 11 were truly orbiting the Earth, as Sibrel insists, the spacecraft would have been completing an orbit every 92 minutes. If this were the case, the Earth in the footage would be rotating much faster.
Explain this. When NASA broadcast this footage to the public, they claimed it was being broadcast live. But in Sibrel's footage, you can clearly hear the controllers in Houston and the Apollo 11 astronauts discussing the need to record the audio for playback.
According to NASA, the astronauts were rehearsing for the upcoming live telecast. Remember, these are the outtakes, not the live footage.
Okay, fair enough. But it's not just the film and the live broadcast that have raised questions about the Apollo missions. Conspiracy theorists have also noticed inconsistencies in the still photographs taken on the moon's surface. One photograph features a rock that appears to have the letter C written on it. Skeptics argue that the letter proves the rock was only a prop.
NASA claimed that the letter was created by an error in the film development process. It was airbrushed out of the photo in future releases.
Theorists have also noted that in several photographs, shadows don't run parallel to each other. In one photograph, the shadow of an astronaut and the shadow of a nearby rock appear to take converging angles, which suggests there were multiple sources of light. This shouldn't be possible since the sun is the only source of light on the moon.
According to NASA, this illusion was created by the distortion of the wide-angle lens used on the camera. Several other discrepancies with the shadows can be explained by the uneven surface of the moon. NASA also points out that while they don't quite run parallel, the shadows all converge at the same vanishing point on the horizon. And if there were indeed multiple sources of light, there would be multiple shadows.
Another issue, there are no stars visible in any of the photographs. Because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, the stars should have been brilliantly visible. Conspiracy theorists claim that NASA blacked out the background of the shots because it would have been impossible for them to recreate an accurate starscape as seen from the moon.
Neil Armstrong himself made a note of this in his first press conference immediately after the mission. None of the astronauts remembered seeing the stars, perhaps because the moon's white surface was too bright for the stars to be visible to the naked eye or to ordinary cameras.
Conspiracy theorists also note that in photographs of the lunar lander from all 6 Apollo missions, there is no crater under the lunar capsule. According to Armstrong, the surface of the moon was a finely grained powder, soft enough to create a perfect print of his boot, which was documented in several photographs. Evidently, though, the powder was not soft enough to show any impact from the module's landing.
NASA scientists point out that the rockets use most of their thrust to slow the Eagle down from the speeds of lunar orbit. By the time they reach the moon's surface, the retro rockets require significantly less thrust. Additionally, it's Earth's atmosphere that channels a rocket's energy directly down. On the moon, the energy disperses outward. Both of these facts explain why there isn't enough thrust to form a crater under the lander.
One of the most well-known discrepancies in the footage is the shot of the flag waving as the astronauts plant it into the moon's surface. Because there is no wind on the moon, how can the flag be waving?
Well, it wasn't. The flagpole that held the American flag was shaped like an upside-down L, with an arm that held the flag outward. NASA points out that the flag's movement resembles the natural pendulum motion one would expect from a free-hanging object moving in a vacuum. Once the kinetic energy caused by the astronaut planting the flag was expended, the flag remained perfectly still.
NASA has an answer for every question about the Apollo footage, don't they? But there's still one question they can't answer. Where are the original tapes?
In 2006, it was discovered that the original tapes from the live broadcast of the moon landing were missing from NASA's archives. An international search effort was undertaken, but after 3 years, they were still nowhere to be found. Ultimately, NASA decided that they had likely reused the tapes and recorded over them.
Conspiracy theorists find this claim dubious. The moon landing was one of the most significant historical moments of the 20th century. The tapes wouldn't have been recorded over on accident. NASA must have erased them because they had something to hide.
As to what exactly that is, they haven't given us a clear answer. Theorists have spent decades attempting to debunk the media produced on the Apollo 11 mission, and science has been able to find an explanation for every so-called discrepancy they point out.
Whatever was on those original tapes may have been the evidence that proved, once and for all, that the moon landing was staged.
Unless those tapes ever resurface, we'll have to stick with what we have now. And from what we have, there's no indisputable evidence that any of the film or photos from the Apollo missions were staged.
But there's also no indisputable evidence that they weren't staged. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. But is the official story that astronauts walked on the moon really the simplest explanation?
Coming up, we'll look into the evidence of whether a moon landing was even possible.
Now, back to the story.
For 50 years, skeptics have questioned whether NASA had the capability to pull off a mission like the Apollo 11 moon landing. The Apollo missions took place in a time when computing power was primitive. Computers weren't commercially available, and the computers that did exist often filled entire rooms.
The onboard computer of Apollo 11 contained 32 kilobytes, less computing power than a modern pocket calculator. This primitive machine supposedly guided the lunar module through a 238,000-mile journey to the moon, an incredibly complex landing, and a takeoff and return journey to Earth.
It does sound implausible, but not impossible. The technological steps leading up to the moon landing were definitely there. The Soviets' unmanned Luna 2 spacecraft landed on the moon's surface a full 10 years before the Apollo 11.
Well, that's the catch. The Soviets made it there, not the U.S. It would have been one thing if the Soviets put a man on the moon in 1969. We've already covered how many milestones the Soviet space program reached while the Americans struggled to get off the ground.
At the same time, in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars, American jet fighters were consistently outperformed by Soviet aircraft. The Soviet-developed MiG-15 was so feared in Korea that soon after its introduction, the U.S. Air Force ended all daytime bombing missions.
So just how were American engineers able to accomplish what Soviet engineers never could when it came to landing on the moon? The Soviets were never able to replicate the Saturn V, the rocket used by the Apollo missions.
The Soviets' closest attempt was the N-1 rocket, but its first test launch failed just 2 weeks before Apollo 11 made its historic journey.
They tested the N-1 3 more times, but it failed every time. In one instance, a failed launch created one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. If the Saturn V was truly able to make it to the moon, why could the Soviets never replicate its success?
Ultimately, the United States was able to prevail over the Soviet Union in the space race the same way they were able to prevail in the rest of the Cold War. They simply had more resources. At the height of the space race in the mid-60s, NASA's budget comprised over 4% of all government spending, the equivalent of over $43 billion a year in today's money.
The CIA estimated that around the same time, the Soviet Union was only spending around $4 billion on their space program, worth about $32 billion today. That's a big difference, but big enough to account for their failure? I'm not sure about that.
Let's take a look at the next piece of evidence. Conspiracy theorists state that a manned moon mission was impossible because humans would have been unable to survive the dangerous radiation in deep space.
Thousands of miles above the Earth, the planet is surrounded by radioactive particles called the Van Allen radiation belts. Soviet scientists surmised that a space capsule would need a thick lead protective shield in order to pass through the radiation fields without endangering the astronauts inside.
The problem, of course, was that a thick lead casing would have made the capsule too heavy to fly.
So, how did NASA get around this problem? Well, they didn't. The outer casing of the Apollo capsule was just a 1/8 inch sheet of aluminum.
NASA scientists were aware of the Van Allen belts, but they dismissed the notion that they were dangerous. Their scientists estimated that the amount of radiation the astronauts would be exposed to during the hours they passed through the belts was the equivalent of a CT scan to the chest.
Conspiracy theorists disagree with NASA on that matter. They take the position of the Soviet scientists that the Van Allen belts were too dangerous to pass through without killing the astronauts inside.
NASA might refute this position by pointing out that the 24 astronauts who were sent on the Apollo missions all made it back safe and sound.
Or perhaps they never left the Earth's orbit and passed through the Van Allen belts in the first place.
For what it's worth, no astronauts have ever passed through the Van Allen belts after the Apollo missions were finished. The only other mission that even came close was in 1998, when a shuttle traveled 350 miles above the Earth to service the Hubble telescope.
So if it's so safe to travel through these radioactive fields, why have no subsequent missions ever done it again? Why has no other country tried to do it?
That's a question to take up with NASA. Perhaps there are other difficulties with sending humans out of the Earth's orbit that have to be taken into account. Or perhaps it's because manned space missions are no longer a top priority. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because we already did it with the Apollo missions and there's not sufficient value in doing it again.
To sum things up, we've established that the United States was willing to do whatever it took to defeat the Soviet Union during the Cold War, even if it meant lying to American citizens.
They definitely had the motive to beat the Soviets to the moon, but that doesn't mean they lied about doing it.
We've gone over the pictures and film NASA produced as evidence of the moon landing, some of which doesn't quite add up.
Actually, it does add up if you believe what the scientists say.
Fair enough. And finally, we've questioned whether or not it was even possible to journey to the moon due to the technological limitations of the time and the dangerous radiation fields that surround the Earth.
Ultimately, it comes down to who you believe, the scientists at NASA or conspiracy theorists with no scientific training.
That's not to say all moon landing conspiracy theorists have no qualifications. In 1974, just 2 years after Apollo 17 made the final manned journey to the moon, a man named Bill Kaysing published the book We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 Billion Swindle. Kaysing worked at Rocketdyne, one of the major contractors that built the rockets for the Apollo program.
Kaysing worked at Rocketdyne, but as a technical writer. And Rocketdyne did build rockets for the Apollo program, but that began after Kaysing left the company in 1963.
Well, the skepticism continues to this day. In 1999, a Gallup poll determined that 6% of Americans believed the moon missions were faked. But after Fox broadcast the documentary Did We Go to the Moon in 2001, that number swelled to 20%.
Do you know what percentage of trained aerospace researchers deny the moon landing? 0. Public opinion is hardly the best way to measure scientific truths.
The advent of the internet has exacerbated the problem. While information on the moon landings is widely available, both in independent publications and on NASA's own website, so too are countless conspiracy theories and unverified claims.
NASA seemed to anticipate the skepticism because the crew of Apollo 11 left a mirror on the moon. They called it the Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector Array. It can be used to measure the distance from the Earth to the moon at any time.
And while a conspiracy theorist may argue that these mirrors could have been planted by an unmanned probe, the Apollo astronauts have placed 3 of them on the moon at the precise landing sites for Apollo 11, Apollo 14, and Apollo 15.
Scientists still use these laser reflectors to measure distance to the moon today. The slight fluctuations in those distances give them valuable information into the moon's geological makeup and gravitational pull. You could see the experiments for yourself if you visited the Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico. It seems like an incredibly complicated ruse to keep up if the moon landings never happened, doesn't it?
Maybe so. I have to admit, all in all, the evidence that the moon landing happened is pretty overwhelming. Photos, videos, records, personal accounts, and even 3 giant mirrors on the moon's surface.
I give this conspiracy theory a 3 out of 10. Skepticism of the moon landing is understandable. It was accomplished long before so many of the technological advances we have today, and it seems like an accomplishment that's almost too great to be true. But while the technological limitations were great, saying they were impossible to overcome dismisses the brilliance and ingenuity of the scientists who worked on the project.
That's true. The moon landings stand as a testament to what humans can accomplish when they stretch the bounds of possibility. Now that the Cold War is long over, it could be time to let the controversy rest and accept the Apollo missions for what they were, a great achievement for humanity.
In the words of the stainless steel plaques left on the moon and signed by all 3 crew members of Apollo 11 and President Nixon, we came in peace for all mankind.